of the foundation with a citizen-led movement and nonprofit organization here in Colombia, creating creative solutions to tackle climate change since 2015. We work to promote climate education, build more resilient and regenerative communities, and promote citizen participation in climate action. First, we would like to remind you that this event has simultaneous translation. If you need the service, you can go to the globe symbol and select the translation into Spanish. Now I would like to share with you the invitation to the 9th version of the Colombian Congress and International Conference on Air Quality and Public Health, CASAP.
Hola, un saludo especial a las personas que están conectadas en este momento. Mi nombre es Juan Felipe Franco y hago parte del Comité Promotor del Congreso Colombiano de Calidad del Aire, Cambio Climático y Salud Pública. Quiero extenderles una especial invitación para que nos acompañen entre el 22 y 24 de marzo en la ciudad de Santa Marta, en la 9ª versión del Congreso. Será un espacio propicio para encontrarnos, para fortalecer las redes de conocimiento y para discutir sobre el abordaje integral que debemos dar a esta importante problemática. Quiero invitarlos a que visiten la página web del CASAP, conozcan los detalles de la agenda y a que se inscriban y participen activamente de esta versión. Hola, un saludo especial a las personas que están conectadas en este momento.
Next, I would like to thank our sponsors, the Family Compensation Fund of Antioquia, CONFAMA, Hill Consulting, the Colombian Congress on Air Quality and Public Health, CASAP, Eco-Registry, Ser Carbono, and ISA. I also want to thank the team of Low Carbon City, especially Eliza Berrin, who is joining us at the end of this talk, and Carolina Rendon, who made this possible. Next, I would like to present Maria Alejandra Gonzalez, which will be our moderator. Maria Alejandra is a PhD. She will join Ian to discuss further the topics that bring us together today. And she's the head of the master's degree in sustainability and is a professor of management at Universidad EAFIT in Colombia. She's a senior researcher of MinCiencias, and she has co-authored 17 books and over 70 academic peer-reviewed papers and several book chapters on the topics of internationalization, sustainability, corporate social responsibility, sustainable development, and international migration. She's also a columnist of Forbes, winner of the Cuervo, Cazurra, and Newbery Award, given to scholars who contributed most to the scientific capacity of academics in Latin America and the Caribbean, and she says that she believes in the transformative power of science and businesses, in the academia and universities as articulators of these dynamics and as connectors between governments, communities, civil society, and business. Thank you, Maria, and she will be presenting us our main speaker.
Thank you so much, Luisa, for this invitation. To me, it's such an honor and it's a pleasure to be here with Low Carbon City, an organization that I know for many years. And thank you, Luisa, for the invitation. And thank you to your team, to Eliza, to Carolina, to Juliana, and everyone else within the team of Low Carbon City. Today, we are with a very important guest. We'll be speaking with somebody, then I will say, well, there is many things, many ways to describe our speaker today, but he's Ian Monroe. He is a scientist, he's an investor, he is a solution-oriented person, he's a climate change solver, like if I might call you like that, Ian. He has over 20 years of experience in solutions that are related to supply chains in the Americas, in Asia, Europe, Africa. He works in climate positive finance. He had a science background. He has undergraduate and his master were in earth science from Stanford. He did a minor in development studies, development economics, and he has also a postgraduate degree in artificial intelligence. So, and since in year 2014, he created one company that is, the name is Ethnocapital, Ian, Ethnocapital, and he's currently the CIO of the company. And this company is a mission-oriented fintech. He's at the same time, he's a lecturer in Stanford, as you can see. And the book that we are talking today, the launch of the book that we are doing here in Latin America today is the name of this textbook, whose name is Solving Climate Change, Guide for Learners and Leaders. And his co-author is Jonathan Kumi. So thank you, Ian, for being here with us today. I'm going to give you the word, and then at the end of your presentation, then we have a little chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alejandra, and the Low Carbon Cities crew, and all of you for having me here. It's really a pleasure. I'm a big fan of what Low Carbon Cities does as well, and I've had the pleasure of coming to speak at Low Carbon Cities conferences in Mexico and Colombia in the past. So it's really great to connect and dive into what this bigger picture is in terms of what we need to do to solve climate change. So I won't spend a lot of time on my bio. I appreciate the glowing intro. Suffice to say, I've spent my whole career in lots of different capacities working on climate solutions, from originally the science and engineering sides of things to now technology, policy, and investing. And I've had a foot in academia teaching and writing about climate solutions the whole time now for over 2 decades in over 30 countries. So I've seen a lot of different aspects of our climate problems, but on the positive side are climate solutions. And that's really what we're going to be focusing on in this talk, and what the Solving Climate Change book is all about, is getting beyond the climate problem, which probably all of us on this webinar know exists, and getting beyond any doubt and debate that climate change is a really serious issue, real serious issue we have to tackle, and get into how we should be solving it. Because as I'm sure everyone on this webinar probably already knows, essentially there's no doubt or debate about climate change. Every scientific organization in the world, every credible government, every credible company now realizes that climate change is going on. And the core truths about climate change that we talk about in the book, which originally were framed up by Professor Kim Nicholas, who currently is a professor at Stanford, also a professor in Sweden, is climate change is real, it's us, it's bad, we're sure, but we can fix it. But we have to hurry. The longer we wait, the worse things get. So here's what the science says, just looking at the chart of our current climate emissions and where they need to go to hold warming to the Paris Agreement level of 1.5 degrees Celsius average warming. And a lot of places already have gone beyond that warming level. And so as you can see, all fossil fuels effectively have to go to zero. We have to get to zero oil use, zero coal use, zero gas use. And we have to shift our agriculture, forestry, and land use from being a net source of climate pollution to actually absorbing the climate pollution that's already up there. And it's not enough to get to net zero. Net zero, based on the latest scientific modeling, really needs to happen by 2040 as a planet. And ideally before that, for anybody with resources. It's not 2050, which is what you see most commonly talked about. That's what the science said now more than 20 years ago. But because we've continued to delay, we've continued to build up pollution in the atmosphere, 2050 no longer works. We have to get to net zero by 2040. And importantly, net zero is not an endpoint. It's just the transition point where we're actually removing more pollution from how we use our land primarily, as well as engineered systems, to get to net climate positive, where every year there's more pollution removed from the atmosphere than is put up into the atmosphere. And that's what we all have to be aiming for. It's not net zero, it's getting to net zero, but then to net climate positive beyond that, really as quickly as possible. And why is that the case? It's because climate change is no longer a problem for the future. It's really a problem for here and now. We're already seeing effectively everywhere around the world climate-related disasters happening in increasing frequency and increasing severity. We are seeing more violent storms. We're seeing more drought. We're seeing more wildfire. We're seeing more flooding. And of course, these things relate to food production, to famine, disease, and even crime and war and human conflict. So there's these second order effects. And we're seeing this all around the world. It's something that can be very personal. For me, I actually started working on climate change because I grew up on a small farm here in Northern California, where I'm giving this talk from. And I was always concerned about the changes I saw in terms of drought and what we could plant. And literally as a small child would have nightmares about wildfire coming through our valley, destroying our family's farm. And unfortunately, those nightmares have now come true. About 5 years ago, we had one of these massive wildfires driven by hurricane force winds just sweep through our valley, burn down every structure on our farm, destroy all our neighbors' homes as well. We had 8 neighbors that got trapped and died, and hundreds more that were effectively left homeless and turned into climate refugees. And it barely even made the national news because there were over a dozen other huge fires going on that same night. And just here in California, over the course of 2 years, we saw over 1 million acres burn, over 20,000 mostly homes burn, over 120 people killed. And of course, around the world, we're seeing this kind of thing going on over and over again. You can see down in the lower right-hand corner, that was what was left of my home and my mother's home that we're still in the process of rebuilding. So climate change is really personal. It's already affecting people in places we love. And of course, climate change is also connected to climate justice and tremendous inequity, where everybody, whether they realize it or not, are seeing some impacts from climate change, whether it's smoke from wildfires or just higher food prices because of disruptions to supply chains. But those that are generally suffering the most are those who can least afford it, and those who have historically contributed the least to putting climate pollution into the atmosphere. So Black, brown, indigenous populations and the poor are generally suffering more and also are the least responsible. And it's impossible for us to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals without solving climate change. It's just an integral piece that connects to all of them. So remembering, when we talk about the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degrees warming, it's really important to remember that that isn't actually a goal, that's a limit. And we're trying to hold warming below 1.5 degrees and then reverse the warming that's happened to get back to the stable climate that humans and every other species evolved with, which is around 280 parts per million of CO2, while now we're over 400 in the atmosphere. And that's because we're already experiencing these climate extremes, and they're going to be much worse. So a 1.5 degree warmer world is a substantially worse world than the world we're already in. And this is all the more reason why net zero, again, is not a target, it's a transition point, and getting to climate positive as soon as possible is what's essential to actually reverse the climate damage that's already happening. So how do we get there? In the textbook that my colleague John Kumi and I just came out with, which you can find more info about that at solveclimate.org, we have an overall framework with 3 essential elements needed to solve climate change, namely ending fossil fuels, minimizing non-fossil greenhouse gas pollution, and then shifting our biosphere, our lands and our oceans to be net climate positive. And then to get those 3 essential elements, we have 8 pillars of climate action that we all need to be working on, really from all levels, from the top down, governments, companies, investors, kind of middle out, and then just bottom up as citizen activists. We need to be electrifying everything, decarbonizing electricity, minimizing our non-fossil greenhouse gas emissions, optimizing and driving towards efficiency, and removing the carbon that's already up in the atmosphere, aligning our incentives. These are more structural elements of it to make sure we're all pushing in the same direction, mobilizing the money necessary to move in the right direction, and really importantly, and often forgotten when we talk about climate solutions, elevating truth about what real solutions are and which ones really need to be prioritized. And so I'll go into a few of the different aspects of these pillars. Again, everybody needs to be working on these 8 pillars of climate solutions. from companies to governments to investors and donors, but as also individuals and communities. And we count communities broadly, including the nonprofit communities that are kind of connective tissue between a lot of these different types of actors. So let's start with electrifying everything. And really, this should be at the top of the list for most of us as individuals in our own lives and for governments at all levels. We should be doing everything we can to take effectively every industry, every piece of machinery that uses fossil fuels and shifting it instead to use electricity. So, of course, electric vehicles are a part of this, personal vehicles, but also trucks, buses, heavy machinery, trains. Electric planes could be a piece, though probably for in the foreseeable future, just short haul flights because of battery density issues. We need to be doing everything we can to electrify our homes and offices, including how we cook, how we heat our homes and cool our homes and offices, and then how we heat water as well. One of the most important technologies here are heat pumps, shifting to electric heat pumps, which are also extremely efficient. I'll talk about that in the efficiency and optimization piece. And it's important to note that a lot of electrification technology doesn't have to be expensive. In fact, over the course of use, typically electrification technology actually saves money because fossil fuel prices are so variable and can be so expensive, whereas electricity generally has been becoming cheaper because renewable energies are getting so much cheaper. And, we think about electric cars and those being expensive in some places. Some places they're actually extremely cheap. In China, for example, there's electric vehicles that are being sold for less than $5,000 US. But it's also electric bicycles and electric scooters and different kind of shorter form transportation that can help get there more quickly, that can be a lot cheaper. For home cooking electrification, just having something as simple as an electric water kettle, which is pretty cheap almost everywhere, is one way to reduce fossil fuel use if you're at least cooking with gas in the home, and shifting over to an electric hot plate, namely an induction electric hot plate, is also a relatively cheap way to shift your home cooking if you're using gas to be electrified. And even if you're using more old conventional electrification technology to be electrified. We also need to be electrifying industry, steel and cement, fertilizer production, chemicals. There are electrification options for all of those coming on board. We need to be upgrading our grid infrastructure to ensure all this electrification technology can come online, including charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, smart grid to be able to manage inflow and outflow of electricity, and batteries really deployed pretty widely to get to be able to not just charge up and use when you need the electricity for a given technology like electric cooking or electric vehicles, but also be able to feed that energy into the grid, or at least smartly charge when those batteries are being charged. For some things like long haul flights, aviation, it may make sense to have electricity-based fuels where we use electricity from renewable energy to produce hydrogen, ammonia, other types of synthetic fuels that look very similar to fossil fuels, but ultimately are taking carbon from the atmosphere or not using carbon at all, getting energy in a fuel form like hydrogen that's coming from renewable energy. And then you have a energy dense fuel that still can perform similar to a fossil fuel, but has effectively zero carbon footprint. And as these electrification technologies come online, we can actually start banning fossil-based technologies that they're replacing, which is already happening in a lot of places around the world. There already are bans on standard internal combustion vehicle engines and vehicle sales that are coming online here in California and many parts of Europe. There's also bans now on gas appliances, gas heating, gas cooking, even gas connections to homes and offices that are starting to become effective here in San Francisco, where I'm giving this talk, in a number of other cities. And so the more we, make fossil fuels inconvenient and inaccessible as electrification technologies are available and cheap, the faster this transition happens. So electrification, really key pillar and really the first thing we should be tackling, though essentially at the same time, we need to be making our electricity as clean as possible by shifting to renewable energy, solar, wind, geothermal, hydro, and then the more energy storage we can get online, the more we can balance out the grid to effectively provide base load power from these renewable sources at the times when the power is always needed. So it doesn't matter if the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing, if you have enough energy storage to level out the grid, provide that base load power. So advances in battery technology, as well as thermal storage, pump hydro, other types of gravity energy storage are important for this transition. Really, a lot of the modeling is showing that it's important to have distributed energy generation. You don't just want big wind farms and solar farms providing power, but you want to have a mix of those big utility scale renewable energy projects and on-site renewable generation, solar panels on roofs, energy storage at homes and offices. And the more we have a mix of both large utility scale renewables and energy storage and on-site renewables and energy storage, the faster we can transition to this 100% clean energy economy that we really need to shift to. And again, much like with electrifying everything, getting to 100% renewable energy, or at least 100% zero carbon energy, because nuclear could be a piece of this in some contexts and other forms of low carbon energy that aren't entirely renewable. It also necessitates us upgrading our grid infrastructure, as we talked about. And the more we price the pollution for fossil fuels, the faster this transition happens as well. So our third pillar is minimizing non-fossil greenhouse gas emissions. The vast majority of the climate pollution causing climate change is coming from burning fossil fuels, burning oil, burning gas, burning coal. But a substantial piece is also coming from non-fossil emissions. It's coming from deforestation, it's coming from methane and NOx from agriculture, particularly from cattle grazing and our consumption of meat. And it's coming from other sources, even secondary sources connected to fossil fuels. There are methane emissions coming from fossil fuels as well. And then there are feedback loops going on, whereas transitions happen in ecosystems. For example, permafrost is melting in the Arctic. That's also enhancing non-fossil methane emissions in the atmosphere. So to focus on minimizing non-fossil greenhouse gas emissions, we say minimize because it's pretty impossible to get to zero, but we really want to reduce as much as possible, because a lot of these non-fossil greenhouse gases, particularly methane, are far more potent than CO2 in terms of their impact on warming the planet. So ending deforestation, having policies in place to push that and to encourage reforestation in areas that have been deforested is essential. Shifting to more plant-based foods in our diet can have a large impact. Managing methane in other ways, like giving animals feed that, particularly cows, that actually reduces their methane emissions. There's some exciting new products coming out that are derived from algae and other synthetic enzymes that you can feed to cows and actually make them produce substantially less methane, around 90% less methane in some cases. And also rice is a major producer of methane, but if we grow rice in a way that minimizes methane emissions, it can make a substantial difference. Being more precise, using precision agriculture techniques with how we fertilize reduces both methane and N2O emissions and other potent greenhouse gas. Part of the problem with flying, which has a very large impact relative per mile for climate change, is not just the direct greenhouse gas pollution from burning fossil fuels as the plane is flying, but actually there are indirect climate impacts from the contrails that those planes create. And there actually are ways to avoid that through using software that monitors where the plane is relative to atmospheric conditions and changes the plane's flight path to minimize the amount of contrails it's putting out and consequently minimize the amount of warming. And a lot of industries we can re-engineer, like cement production, for example, and fertilizer production, refrigerant chemical production, we can re-engineer to reduce a lot of emissions that don't come directly from burning fossil fuels, but actually come from the chemical processes themselves. Like currently, production of Portland cement produces a lot of CO2, but there are exciting cement alternatives now that don't produce as much CO2, and in some cases actually absorb CO2 as they're being produced. So it can actually become a net carbon removal, climate positive technology. Often, historically, when we've talked about climate change, we've talked about efficiency and optimization as being the low-hanging fruit that we should go for first. We put it down the list of pillars. It's important, we should be doing it, but there's no way through our current system of fossil fuel use to solve climate change just through efficiency and optimization. It's just about less bad. Really, we should be focusing on electrifying, shifting to renewables, minimizing non-fossil greenhouse gases, and at the same time implementing efficiency and optimization, but that alone is not going to get us there. But with that said, it is important. So minimizing waste everywhere, energy waste, but also food waste. As probably many of you are aware, a huge amount of the food we produce actually is wasted either on the farm or when it gets to supermarkets, or even when it's sitting in your refrigerator. Minimizing that food waste reduces all the fossil fuel and associated other greenhouse gas emissions related to that food waste. Promoting innovation by funding research and development, universities, having startup support infrastructure, constantly helps improve technologies to make them more efficient, to optimize the benefit of those technologies relative to the climate pollution. We also have the ability to shift to a lot of materials and processes that can reduce climate impacts, not just related to energy again, but also related to production processes like cement, as mentioned, consumer packaging, how we produce plastics, which I'll get into a bit more when talking about carbon removal. Having clear efficiency standards and labels can help all of us as individual consumers and large consumers like governments really understand which options actually are the best for climate change. So having standardized universal climate labeling is important. Again, we can actually ban inefficient technologies, which we've seen many governments do, starting with incandescent light bulbs, which are horribly inefficient compared to fluorescent lighting, which in turn is inefficient compared to LEDs, which is what almost everybody everywhere in the world is shifting to now. So as more efficient alternatives come into the market and they're made affordable enough, we can ban the inefficient technologies to ensure they don't keep getting out there into people's homes. And then we can reward efficiency, and that really drives towards a more optimized picture in terms of how our society is operating relative to climate pollution. So for using energy, we can shift power pricing to make it more expensive to use when there's less renewable energy available, and cheaper to use when there's more renewable energy available. And that helps with that shift for those that have flexible loads. We can also, for example, price driving on roads to have what's called congestion pricing, where it's more expensive to drive on a road if it's more congested, which is a less efficient time to drive because that makes more people get stuck in traffic and use more energy in that process. So there's different ways to reward efficiency and optimization that can, again, accelerate these process transitions. And as mentioned, one of the great technologies for both electrification and efficiency is the heat pump, which can be used for home and office heating and cooling, and is 3 times more efficient than conventional approaches, and also can be used for water or even industrial process heating as well. So heat pump technologies are a really important piece of this efficiency transition along with electrification transition. With all that said, all the technological pillars we've been talking about in terms of reducing emissions have been about reducing emissions to as close to zero as possible, but we still are going to need to remove the emissions that are already up there in the atmosphere, draw that pollution back underground or into stabilized forms. And that's the only way that we actually hold warming below 1.5 degrees. And again, that's not even a goal, that's a limit. We're trying to get back to the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that really humans and every other species evolved with. So that's going to require a whole lot of scale up of carbon removal technology. And I just want to make a quick distinction between carbon removal and carbon offsets. So carbon removal technologies have 100% real climate benefit. You know that carbon removal, at least if it's done in a very permanent form, is really additional to what would have happened otherwise, and it doesn't have leakage that could happen. Removing the benefit doesn't, and it's relatively permanent. Carbon offsets, on the other hand, which have been around for now a couple of decades, and I used to work in that world doing forestry offsets and offsets related to agricultural projects. Unfortunately, the carbon offset market has had a whole lot of problems in terms of fraud, quite frankly. There are some projects that I think are good and have real substantial climate benefit, but a whole lot of carbon offset projects have had problems related to additionality. Namely, they've been selling credits for things that would have happened anyway, for forests that would have already been conserved, for example, as well as problems related to leakage. Maybe a forest is conserved one place, but that enhances pressure, the trees are cut down next door. And also permanence. Maybe a forest is conserved. I'm using forest here, but this applies to a lot of other carbon offset project types as well. But for the forest example, maybe a forest is preserved for a given chunk of time, but then it changes landowners and it gets cut down. Or I've actually seen this with carbon offset projects I've worked on. It's in the middle of a wildfire and all that carbon the forest was storing then goes up and it becomes a net source of pollution, yet the carbon credits continue to be sold. So there are a lot of real challenges with the carbon offset market. Carbon removal, on the other hand, is taking carbon that's already up in the atmosphere, pulling it out, locking it up in as permanent a form as possible and putting it underground. And you can do this with a combination of natural systems and engineered systems. One of the technologies that I'm really excited about that is a company based here in San Francisco. It comes from a company called Charm Industrial, and they take biomass. So plants have taken carbon out of the atmosphere as they've grown. They specifically are working with agricultural waste like corn stover, the stalks and cobs and things left over when corn is grown. And then they're converting it into what they call a combination of biochar and bio-oil. Biochar gets mixed into the soil, helps with agricultural productivity, and bio-oil is actually injected underground. So it's taking carbon that the plants took out of the atmosphere, converting it into this bio-oil and putting it back underground, effectively a reverse oil process. And then that carbon, it should be stored for thousands of years based on the chemistry. So it's a super permanent carbon solution. And so there's other technologies out there that some of you have probably read about that are using direct air capture, take carbon out of the air, put it back underground, or turn it into rocks. Really, carbon removal technologies should prioritize permanence in terms of the technology. So locking up carbon for ideally thousands of years, at least hundreds of years. There are also what are called CCUS, carbon capture and utilization and storage technologies that are capturing carbon and putting it into materials like the built environment, just using more wood for buildings, biocement, bioplastics. We can replace a lot of our current plastic use that comes from fossil fuels to coming from biology, where that carbon is taken out of the air, put into plastics. And actually, if we put those plastics in a landfill, it's a good thing because it's basically similar to Charm Industrial's process, putting that carbon from the air back underground. But with CCUS, there can be permanence questions. How long do those materials actually lock up carbon? For average building, 100 years or so is the expected lifespan. What happens to that carbon in the wood after that is an open question. We also can store carbon in forests, farms, other ecosystems, but that carbon often has real serious permanence concerns where, as we've talked about, forests can burn down, they can change ownership and get cut down, they can have bark beetles and other diseases that are becoming more prominent, cause massive tree die-offs. Similar with farms, a farmer can decide to do something that's beneficial to climate for a few decades, but is that actually going to be carbon that stays there long-term if it changes ownership, if just climatic conditions change what's going on with soil chemistry? Those are big open questions. There's been a movement amongst some to really shift what companies are allowed to do in terms of net zero and climate positive claims to require not just carbon offsets, but at least some portion of carbon removal payments. And carbon removal, to be clear, is historically more expensive, particularly if it's in a very permanent form, like putting it underground, but you don't have any of these additionality concerns. And generally, if you do it right, you don't have any permanence or leakage concerns, which is why there's generally been this shift, particularly with large tech companies that are trying to move towards being more climate friendly. Here in Silicon Valley, they've been shifting from offset payments to carbon removal payments because they're seen as just frankly more honest and actually more climate beneficial than offsets. This is looking at where, again, we need to go in terms of decarbonizing. You can see that this is all getting to net zero and beyond, getting to zero fossil fuel use, essentially. This piece is effectively all the carbon removal that's needed. It's shifting our agriculture, forestry, land use from being a net source of pollution to a net absorber of the pollution that's up there. And then there are also natural systems, land sinks, like existing forests and ocean sinks that are absorbing carbon. These are these lines here. But you can see this is a massive transition that has to happen. So there is this open question about how do we get all this money needed to pay for carbon removal services. There's even been some interesting proposals around creating a new currency that would be backed by the world's largest central banks that would just go to pay for carbon removal. And you can see more on one way how this system could work at this nonprofit globalcarbonreward.org. So this, again, this is all the carbon removal as well as natural sinks with these lighter colors here. And then once we get beyond net zero to net climate positive, that's really what we're aiming for. So I've talked about the technological pillars of what we need to do to solve climate change, but it's not just about technology. It's also about the supporting infrastructure, the supporting policy framework, and just frankly, the supporting communication framework about how we're talking about climate and our incentives for actually taking action to solve climate change. So one of the important pillars that we always should be thinking about whenever we design policies related to climate change, or even just our own lives, our own company incentive structures, is are we aligning incentives to continuously push to decarbonize and get to net climate positive? One thing we need to do is to make climate action convenient as much as possible so that climate solving technologies, whether it's electric vehicles or electrified cooking or plant-based foods, are just always available, often the default option. So you have to opt into the more polluting technology. You have a default, which is the more climate-friendly option. Of course, we need to make sure that climate solution technologies are affordable. Ideally, they are the cheapest option. And that way, there's just you don't even really need to care about climate change. You just go for the cheapest option, the default option, and you're already part of the climate solution. We can also work to make climate action technologies, climate action lifestyle choices more socially desirable and make polluting unacceptable. whereas polluting right now is just kind of the default way of living for a lot of us. The more we can link job performance to climate targets, the better, whether that be government officials looking for promotion, that being based on how they're helping their given responsibilities decarbonize, or company managers, how they're helping their given responsibilities within a company decarbonize, have that actually directly related to job performance. That, of course, elevates how climate is viewed in terms of importance. We can be much more public and transparent about the climate footprints of all of us, really, at different levels, from the climate footprints of governments, not just national governments, but also local governments, cities, states, provinces, to the carbon footprint of companies, to the carbon footprint of investors and investment portfolios, investment products, which is a big thing I work on at Etho Capital, and the carbon footprint even of us as individuals, which is something that actually brought me into Etho Capital through a startup tracking individual carbon footprint. We can also, we're talking a lot of carrots, but we can also actually have more legal liability for particularly large polluters, and linked to climate damages. And I'll talk a little bit in the mobilized money piece about how really we should be linking the profit currently from pollution to paying for climate damages and climate solution technology implementation. And really importantly, we should be doing everything we can do to effectively ban large polluter interest money from politics, which unfortunately everywhere in the world, certainly here in the US, in Europe, anywhere there are interests in status quo fossil fuel pollution technologies, those interests are generally trying to influence politicians to slow down any transition, allow them to keep making money by polluting. So the more that we can get that money out of politics with different policies, the better. The more that we can stop a revolving door between those that get paid by the fossil fuel industry and other climate polluting technology industries to lobby governments. Often those same people were policymakers, and there's kind of this back and forth revolving door between the lobbyists for pollution and the policymakers who regulate them. We can put bans on those kind of practices as well, and that really aligns incentives around policymaking to actually push towards decarbonization, as opposed to trying to drag our feet and keep with the status quo to keep profits with polluters. I mentioned one of the things that brought me into what I now do with climate investing at Etho Capital and kind of the bigger picture in climate solutions was helping launch a technology platform called OroEco that tracked personal climate footprint based on personal spending and lifestyle choices. And it's effectively turned that into a social game. So you could see how much money you could save by decarbonizing your life. You could also see kind of social status and get virtual prizes, how you're comparing versus your friends, your community. I bring up this example just to show that if we could do this as a startup, we could pretty easily be tracking all of our individual climate footprints and all of our company climate footprints and government climate footprints. We can use technology to make invisible climate pollution visible and then actionable in different ways. And the more we do that, the more we have incentives to actually reduce that emissions, not just talk about it. And more we can also see what choices really make a difference versus those that maybe we talk about a lot, like recycling, for example, that don't have a huge impact on climate, which isn't to say we shouldn't do it. It's just not at the top of the list of things that actually help solve climate change. So a huge piece of what needs to happen is shifting money out of problems into solutions. We need to be working to make the option that's best for climate the cheapest option, whether that's EVs, clean power, climate-friendly foods, appliances, et cetera. We need to make some of these technologies have higher upfront costs, but then they have lower operating costs, like electric vehicles, for example. So having loans and grants to help with this shift, pay that upfront cost, make that transition as accessible as possible for individuals and businesses. It's important. Pricing pollution. above the social cost of carbon, which is estimated to be in many studies over $100 a ton, in some cases 60 plus a ton. That's an essential element, or at least it would be a very helpful element in accelerating this transition. And then that revenue can go both into funding decarbonization, technology scale up, as well as adaptation and resilience, and compensating communities that are already suffering loss and damage from climate change. Another way we could help just align incentives while putting money in the right places is taking some of the money that we raise from pricing pollution and actually just returning it to citizens in what's called a climate dividend, and do that in larger sums to lower income communities that may otherwise have distributional impacts from things like higher fossil fuel prices. So offset that effectively by giving particularly poorer communities more money that's raised from pricing pollution. Really, we should be doing everything we can to take the huge amounts of money that fossil fuel companies are currently making, particularly with war profiteering from the current situation with Russia invading Ukraine, take that money and, as much as possible, redirect fossil fuel profits into paying for climate solution scale up and paying for loss and damages. We now have loss and damage, in theory, a loss and damage fund coming out of the latest big UN climate negotiation, COP27, but at this point, there's no funding going into it. A lot of that funding, in our view at least, should be coming from the fossil fuel industry and others that are directly profiting from pollution. Of course, we should be also divesting our investments as individuals, investing for our retirement, and as institutions, public pension funds, sovereign wealth funds should be divesting from fossil fuels, which by necessity have to effectively die. It's a dying industry. Again, looking at that chart of all fossil fuels going to zero, it makes sense just economically to divest from fossil fuels, invest in climate leaders everywhere else, which is what I focus on with my day job at Etho Capital, showing investors you can do that, and in many cases even be more profitable while doing that. And then we're also effectively voting for either climate pollution or climate solutions every time we shop, every time we're buying food, buying clothes, buying appliances for our home, even deciding where we want to live. So just making climate-friendly shopping and lifestyle choices. And the more we have accurate labeling related to climate impacts, the more we can make those informed choices. In terms of how much money needs to be shifting, the estimates from the UN are that in terms of climate solution technology scale up and adaptation and resilience, we should be investing somewhere around $4 trillion per year, which is a very big number. But we should also remember that the fossil fuel industry, actually, we're giving them more money than that every single year already. We're currently spending on oil, coal, and gas about $6 trillion per year. So right there, there's already more than enough money that we're currently spending on fossil fuels to shift into climate solutions, adaptation and resilience, and some for loss and damage as well. And that's just our direct spending on fossil fuels. If you factor in subsidies, if you factor in all the damages from air pollution and other issues, then fossil fuels start to look much, much more expensive. It actually starts to look, based on International Monetary Fund and other studies, it looks close to 23 trillion per year that we're spending on the fossil fuel industry. So far more than is needed to transition to climate solutions is already being spent effectively on fossil fuels right now. So that's just something that's important to keep in mind. So with Etho Capital, we look at the full climate footprint of companies, and we help create portfolios that are based on the most decarbonized companies, what we call the climate leaders, in effectively every industry in the economy, aside from the industries we consider just inherently irresponsible and unsustainable, like fossil fuels, but also weapons, private prisons, tobacco, a few other just inherently irresponsible industries. And it's really important when you're doing this kind of analysis to calculate the complete climate footprint of companies, which in Climate Geek speak means the scope 1, scope 2, and really importantly, also scope 3 emissions of companies. With scope 1 and scope 2 being a company's direct pollution at its factories and its electricity use, and then scope 3 being effectively everything else, all the pollution connected to a company's supply chain, all the different materials and semi-finished products that go into providing the services and products that a company makes. And then also the downstream use of the company's products and services are part of scope 3. And when you do that kind of full analysis, you actually find that some companies are net climate positive already, meaning that they have a net benefit for climate for every dollar you invest in them. Like electric vehicle companies, renewable energy companies, sustainable food companies, those can already be net climate positive because the downstream climate benefits of the products and services they produce outweigh all the climate pollution related to producing those products and services. But you don't see this unless you do the full climate accounting, which in most cases is still not going on. It's something we do at ETHO that helps us find which companies really are the best for climate, really are the climate leaders, and align with overall environmental, social, and governance criteria beyond that. And this is just a quick illustration for how that kind of climate math can change how you think about a company. So in the case of ExxonMobil, the huge oil and gas company, if you look at just the scope 1 and 2 emissions, it looks relatively high in terms of pollution per dollar invested. But if you include the scope 3 emissions, which include, importantly, all the pollution related to burning the oil and gas that Exxon produces, which is kind of crazy, but that's actually not the standard way to look at the carbon footprint for a fossil fuel company. Often, all the fossil fuel products they produce, you ignore that in standard climate accounting, mainly because the industry has lobbied to have it that way. If you do this more complete climate accounting, you see that Exxon's climate footprint is over 6 times worse than the more commonly used scope 1 and scope 2 analysis. On the flip side, if you look at a renewable energy company like Vestas, the wind energy company, just looking at scope 1 and 2 pollution, it looks like there still is some pollution because you're not calculating the climate benefit of the wind energy that it puts into the world. When you do add that in scope 3 climate accounting, you can see that actually it has negative emissions for every dollar invested. Namely, it's a net climate positive investment. So it actually benefits the climate for every dollar you put into that wind energy company. And so with ETHO, we've shown that you can actually create entire portfolios that reflect a really broad diversity of companies that are similar to the global stock market and actually be net climate positive, or at least substantially reduced in terms of climate pollution for every dollar invested. Our flagship ETF, the ETHO ETF, based on the ETHO Climate Leadership Index, has been now substantially outperforming in many cases the US stock market for over 7 years. I should make our SEC happy by saying past performance can't guarantee future results, but certainly over the last 7 years, we've seen this strategy of investing in climate leaders, divesting from bad actors, generally actually doing better than what conventional index benchmarks have been doing. So I'm happy to geek out about climate investing all day, but really this is about the bigger picture, how we get, again, to net climate positive overall, and moving the money out of problems into solutions is one big piece of it. But we also need to be doing all these other pillars. And the final pillar that we talk about in the book, which is really important that we often forget, is elevating truth. And that really can come in a lot of different forms. It can come from mandatory climate education at all levels, from grade school kids. I have a almost 4-year-old who already understands the basics of fossil fuels being polluting, to mandatory climate education through primary, secondary school, university degrees, and even those going back to school for professional education. Having a climate component, really, in my view at least, should be essential and mandatory. And you have some places like Spain, for example, where mandatory climate education nationally already is coming into play. One of the ways we're constantly educated or miseducated is just the media, and what we read, what we see on TV, what we see through social media. And so we can work in mandatory public service announcements everywhere in both traditional media and new online social media that elevate core truths about not just climate problems, but also climate solutions. And a big piece we also should be working on everywhere that we can is ending all the disinformation. There's been a huge amount of money, often in the shadows, behind the scenes, coming from the fossil fuel industry and other established polluters to try to just muddy the waters in terms of public understanding about what's causing climate change and what should be done to solve it. Because what should be done to solve it is ending all fossil fuel use as quickly as possible. So we can find companies that are amplifying, that are creating disinformation, that are amplifying disinformation and profiting from climate lies. And we can also ban advertising for fossil fuel products and products that are inefficient that use fossil fuels, like fossil fuel using vehicles, fossil fuel using appliances, etc. Also, as mentioned, climate labeling around appliances, other types of products, food, could have a big impact in helping educate all of us what really are the climate solutions. And it's essential that that climate labeling do this full scope 1, 2, and also essentially scope 3 carbon accounting to really be a complete, accurate source of information. And that can include climate labeling on investment products, which is something that we're working on with Etho Capital. It's important in our climate truth elevation messaging. It can get very complicated because climate change literally connects to almost everything all over the world. Really, we just should be elevating the most simple, basic core truths and the most important solutions as much as possible. And I'd say those core elements we should focus on is ending fossil fuel use everywhere we can as quickly as possible, and ending deforestation and some of the other large sources of non-fossil emissions as quickly as possible, and encouraging reforestation. And circling back to Professor Kim Nicholas, who I'm actually teaching a class with at Stanford later today, the 5 core climate truths I think we all should be able to repeat are: climate change is real, it's caused by us, it's bad, we're really sure, 100% scientific certainty on this, and we can fix it, but we better hurry, because the longer we wait, the worse the damages become and the harder it becomes to reverse those damages, because climate change is a cumulative problem, right? Emissions are constantly building up in the atmosphere. And as we think about elevating truth, we should think about doing it wherever we can. Each one of us can be an effective climate messenger for somebody, whether it's just our family, our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers, or those we have a wider reach to, everybody that is hearing information from our companies or from our governments. We all need to be part of messaging these core climate truths, and not just messaging climate problems, because if we just do that, all the behavioral psychology shows that often people tune out and just feel overwhelmed, paralyzed. It's essential to include any messaging about climate problems with climate solutions, with the hope that it can be better, that it can be solved. And it really can. We have almost all the solutions we need already. And we're working on the few that we don't yet have, or that just need to be made a bit cheaper. It's really just about implementing those solutions as quickly as possible.
Thanks.
Most
Ian.
people still don't understand that climate change is happening. Most
Yeah.
people do know that climate change is happening, but they
Can
don't
you hear me?
cause for fossil fuels. Yep.
Sorry, yeah, I would love to open the floor also a little bit for some questions with Maria, which she's also a researcher, and we can talk about what academia can be doing about this, and the alliances that we can do between business, governments, the banks, and all of these ecosystems to go further into these solutions we've been talking about. Is it okay for you?
That sounds great. I'll just wrap up this one thought, which is most people understand climate change is happening, but they still don't understand it's because we're burning fossil fuels. They don't understand why. And if you don't understand why, you can't get into the solutions. And we don't also understand that fossil fuels are already connected to 1/5 of every death around the world is connected to fossil fuel air pollution. as well as a lot of other pieces. So there's a lot of co-benefits to solving climate change. So with that, sorry to be over time, and I'll push over to Alejandra.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you for this presentation. Sometimes it's so difficult to find somebody that is at the same time critical, at the same time is rigorous, at the same time inspirational, and at the same time useful. And your presentation was that. So thank you for everything that we have learned, but also for the ideas that you gave us to implement and to move to action, the deep action that are needed. I guess for us, there are many questions from the public, and there are many questions also by the organizers, and there are many questions from myself. So I'm going to try to formulate to you some questions, and so that we can have a conversation in here. So there are, one second. Today, I was listening to someone. I was talking to Luisa Grajales, the CEO of Low Carbon City, and I was telling her that I was in a presentation by someone, an author, who has a book that said, the book is that you have to fall in love with the problem and not with the solution. And that one is something that is quite interesting in here, because sometimes we think in issues like we have oxygen, hydrogen, or we have any other type of solutions that have been tested in the past, and we think that the solutions for climate change are already exist, and we don't give enough room for experimentation and for trial, and we don't trust ourselves enough for trial, and that one is what you're presenting here is we don't have much time here. So how can we move to these risk taking in terms of being more active? Because you said something that is very clear. It's that you have these messages climate change is real, it's human caused, it's bad. Sure, but it's the most important thing in here, and the key message is we can fix it, but we have to do it now. And if we want to move now, then we have to move to this risk-taking to move to different trials in the real time and to experimentation. So how can we mobilize new generations to experiment more to find solutions for climate change?
Yeah, I like that quote a lot, that we need to fall in love with solving the problem, not any individual solution, because that's entirely true. We need to understand the core causes of the problem, namely burning fossil fuels and other sources of climate pollution, particularly deforestation. But how we fix those things, the technologies are evolving and changing. I'd argue that we already have effectively all the solutions we need for most of the solving of climate that needs to happen. So we should be implementing renewables as quickly as possible, energy storage to get to 100% renewables, and in some places, maybe other forms of low carbon energy, like nuclear. But we shouldn't fixate on, I guess, the perfect being the enemy of the good. But we also should be always trying to improve technologies to make them more perfect. So that's where funding research and development at universities, companies funding research and development, having support for startups that are innovating in the space, and startup nonprofits that are innovating models of communicating that can be more effective as well. Those are all important pieces of the solution, because the more we improve technologies, the cheaper they become, the more they amplify positive co-benefits, and reduce any harmful trade-offs as those technologies scale up. So I think it's a yes and kind of scenario where we need to implement everything that we can, that we already have, but we don't, the best solutions of today won't necessarily be the best solutions of tomorrow. So we should continue to be improving and just monitoring which new technologies are evolving that we may change to. Like lighting technology is a great example, right? Where we've had bans on incandescent light bulbs in a lot of places, though not everywhere. And there was a shift to fluorescent lighting, but now LEDs are much more efficient, generally cheaper than fluorescent lights. And they also don't have mercury and some of the other problems with fluorescent lighting. So there's been this transition, right, where the the climate solution has now become the outdated technology from a newer, better climate solution. And I think we'll continue to see that all the time. And ultimately it's a good thing, but it shouldn't stop us from implementing the best available climate solution right now.
Thank you. And you raised something that is critical for countries like Colombia and many other developing countries or countries in the South. We are in this situation where we depend on oil revenues for our social programs. We depend on social revenues for climate adaptation. And then we have this situation where we are really deeply needing the capital from the oil revenues to have both climate transition and at the same time energy transition, especially when we are looking for different alternatives of energy, renewables, or any other kind of a new type of energies that we will be able to produce. Then that one it is, how can you balance when you have a country like Colombia in where we need, then we have very limited financial resources. You provided some elements, but at the national level, how a country like Colombia should do, like if for doing those transitions, we need capital, we need economic growth. So how can we do it? Like we cannot have the same recipe for countries like Colombia, same that they have recipes from countries in Europe or Canada or New Zealand. So yeah, when we have limited financial resources and when especially the programs for the more vulnerable one depends on the revenues of oil. What kind of decisions how you can advise, like if you said leaders of our country or a country like Colombia or any other country of the audience that is here today, that is country in the South or developing nations?
Frankly, it's just going to take some hard but necessary choices, because every region that produces oil, including even here in California, we are actually one of the leading oil producers. It's not talked about very much. California is an oil producing state, and it's actually very dirty oil that comes out of California. And of course, Texas and many other parts of the US produce fossil fuels. And everyone connected to that industry says, we don't have enough money, we need that money. But frankly, that industry just needs to phase out. And that's where everything is pushing. And in our view, it's irresponsible not to help transition that workforce and transition from the assumption that that revenue will be coming in. So really, certainly there should be no profit from fossil fuel transition right now. There should be, or from fossil fuel industry, that the profits that are currently being made from fossil fuels should really close to 100% be going into climate positive technology solution transition, to adaptation and resilience, to pay for the damage that those fuels are causing ultimately. And that in some places is starting to happen, but it certainly needs to happen a lot more. But you're always going to have the argument from any industry that, hey, we can't afford this transition. But to solve the problem, that transition has to happen. So we have, at some point, everybody making fossil fuels, every government needs to just say no more. And us as citizens need to demand no more, because ultimately, again, the damages, you may see that money flowing into your account, but the damage, the long-term damage that's being caused by continuing to get that revenue from the industry is much greater than the short-term revenue that you're getting. If you just look at that climate accounting, again, it's not from some nonprofit. It's from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. There's estimates around $23 trillion per year, and a lot of that is long-term baked-in damage, as well as short-term pollution. Fossil fuels are killing, literally, from just direct air pollution, not climate change, around 10 million people every single year. That's about 1 in 5 deaths are caused directly from the fossil fuel industry. So to say that we need this revenue, that we're dependent on this revenue, quite frankly, is suicidal. It's kind of similar to say, well, we need a bunch of revenue from the tobacco industry to support our government funding. We know those cigarettes are going to kill millions of people. They are every year, but we need that money, so we're just going to have to look the other way. So it's not an easy choice, but it's a choice that has to be made, to set limits, to push this transition as quickly as possible. Again, to take the money there should be zero profit coming from this fossil fuel transition for the fossil fuel industry. Any profit should be going directly into accelerating the transition. And you have I actually had an interesting conversation with a representative from the national oil company in Colombia when I was at the big UN climate conference, COP27, talking about these challenges. You actually have some additional ability in Colombia to help this transition move because of the national control that you have over the oil industry, which is unique compared to some other places where it's more privatized. But again, it's just a hard choice that needs to be made. And the wind down of the fossil fuel industry really needs to be done with the assumption that we're pushing for net zero by 2040. And really everybody who has money should be pushing faster. And there's no way around it. It's always going to be a hard choice, but there's no way to say, hey, we're going to be the last ones producing fossil fuels and we can't afford that transition. We all have to do it. Rich countries, poor countries, everywhere in between, we all have to do it. That's just how the math works. That's math and physics. There's no politics ultimately around the math and physics of solving climate change.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is not, but at the same time, it's like you have this angle of having these solutions in our center within the concept of climate justice, and it's precisely what you have explained, how you can do this redistribution of the, like when you do these hard choices, what you have to have in mind and to whom do you have to serve the first. There is one concept that it's not a new concept. It was a concept in 1989, and this concept is the concept of megawatts. And this concept of megawatts is like that it's happened under the principle that the best energy that we need and the best energy for the environment and the best energy for climate is the energy that we don't consume. So like all the efforts that could be done in terms of, as you said, like efficiency in terms of energy, like energy efficiency and optimization, but also in different other projects. So like this concept of megawatts, I like that one is like, although it's old, it has over 20 years life of the concept. I've never had heard it, but it's like that one is one relation. When we talk about climate change, we are often like overlapping the agenda of energy to have sustainable energy and climate change, precisely for what you explained it, of the strong relationship or the relation that between any fossil fuels and climate solutions for climate change. Ian, going back to, well, I'm sorry, I'm just for commenting those things like out of the topic, but very connected. We have a country like Colombia. We have right now over 70% of our energy depends on hydropower. And well, climate fluctuations and climate uncertainty and many things, so like we know that we are, but also history of climate performance within the country, we know that we cannot really rely on the rainfall that is needed to move the dams and plus everything else. So we are highly dependent in the country of an energy that is not that clean, if you want to say it, neither that reliable. So we have this trilemma that is often what as is known within the energy circles, like the trilemma of having energy that is affordable, energy that is secure, and energy that is reliable. So within Colombia, that is a country that has those issues that you have already explained how to solve in terms of like the transition. But if we have an issue here, that we don't have alternatives to oil, not even for providing our own, then we don't have even not enough hydro for providing domestic energy. What can we do to how we move from that trilemma of energy, of having energy that is affordable, secure, and reliable?
So I'd say the biggest single thing that Colombia and really almost everywhere in the world should be doing is scaling up solar power generation as quickly as possible, as big as possible. And solar in most markets now, if you look at the full levelized cost of electricity, it's by far the cheapest. It's cheaper than every fossil fuel option, including natural gas. And that's even before you calculate the additional climate costs of fossil fuels. That's just base load cost to install it. And then, of course, where wind actually works economically in windy areas, it makes a lot of sense. And wind and solar often pair well because solar obviously is producing power during the day, whereas wind tends to be producing more power at night when it's windier and kind of in those evening transition times. So wind and solar, adding as much of it as you can. Ultimately, it's actually just cheaper. It's cheaper than conventional fossil. It's generally cheaper than new build hydro. With that said, yes, hydro everywhere is becoming less predictable, including here in California as well, because of what we're already seeing with climate change. But it actually is a really important piece to keep online if we can. It has other environmental trade-off issues, but it is actually one of the best ways to have more predictable, when the dams are full at least, base load, low carbon power. And you can actually engineer it with pump storage systems, where one of the cheapest ways to store renewable energy, say extra solar energy produced during the middle of the day when there's lots from the solar panels, but there's not as much being used, you can use that in pumped hydro systems to effectively store that energy by pumping the water uphill into a dam and then letting it out when that is necessary. And so building in pumped hydro to go with existing hydro infrastructure is often one of the cheapest ways to have lots of energy storage that helps get to 100% renewable grid.
Thank you, Ian. I'm going to ask you two more questions, and then I'm going to pass to my colleagues that are going to lead the conversation with the audience. Two things in here. I'm going to ask the two questions at the same time. So do you have well, of course, like the emphasis of the book of being climate positive and the maths and the importance of doing well your check and balance to make sure that the maths of what you do positive for climate overweights of what you do negative, like that your positive actions towards climate overweight the negative impacts of the emissions themselves. But here you have, we have this uncertainty and like marine limitations in terms we can have certain elements to measure our emissions, but then we have the uncertainty at the same time. What is the importance of moving towards scenario analysis? That one is one question. And second question, do you have a background in artificial intelligence? And there is a question that I must ask because that is the topic for the last 2 weeks. I'm sure that you can anticipate. What is going to be the role of generative text, machine learn technologies like Chat, GPT, and other solutions like artificial intelligence issues, like knowing that the artificial intelligence itself has a huge amount of consumption of energy and has a lot of negative impact by not just by the way that is needed, the infrastructure, but also in terms of the way that the energy that is consumed by the operation, but also the things that is required for sourcing minerals and sourcing different things that at the same time are high emitters. So one thing is like on scenario analysis, and the second one it is how can we how can we benefit of Chat, GTP, and other artificial intelligence solutions, and how can we work together with artificial intelligence to solve these major issues and major challenges for humanity, such as climate change. So those are the two questions. And remember, I'm going to pass also to my colleagues for the questions with the audience.
Yeah, well, I see those questions as kind of connected, actually, as one of the more interesting uses of artificial intelligence that I've seen recently, and of course I'm biased in this direction, is to help with the scenario analysis, actually, to run much more complex agent-based models, looking at different climate solution pathways and kind of different scenarios to get to net climate positivity as quickly as possible, how these different climate pillars can interact and kind of those specifics. But with that said, I frankly don't think we need a whole lot more scenario analysis. I think we should keep doing it, but we effectively already know what we need to do, which is in fossil fuel use as quickly as possible and draw down the pollution that's already up there, and minimize non-fossil greenhouse gas emissions. So there's every single scenario run by the UN, and every academic institution says basically exactly that same thing. It's really just about how quickly we need to do it. And the longer we wait, the faster we need to do it, because the more pollution is built up that we need to remove. So I don't see, additional scenario analysis really being a key piece to this. I think it just keeps on updating us about how far behind we are and how much faster we need to move. Specifically with ChatGPT and other AI related to creating text and content, images that look, very close to what a human would create. I see that as both a substantial part of maybe the solution, but probably more realistically a substantial part of the problem in terms of misinformation in particular. There's a huge amount of disinformation that is constantly being funded by the fossil fuel industry behind the scenes in lots of different ways to make it seem like we're locked into a fossil fuel economy and that a transition to renewable energy and other climate solution alternatives is bad in different ways. And AI can help optimize the messaging to target audiences, to amplify new misinformation, both in terms of images and text, and then optimize how that misinformation, disinformation is like deliberate misinformation is put out to the public. So, it's really essential for us to effectively have regulations to take this stuff out and label it as effectively as possible, and really fine and penalize those that are producing it and profiting from it. And AI can also be part of the solution in helping identify this disinformation and helping remove it. But I see, ChatGPT and other AI technologies as probably being ultimately more problems than solutions, but they do have some useful elements, all the things that we use AI for through platforms like Meta, Facebook, et cetera, for targeting ads. We can also use to target positive climate education efforts, right? To make sure that the right messages with the right messengers are reaching the right people and actually shaping understanding around the core elements of what needs to happen to solve climate change, and also around the core benefits. I skipped over this slide, but again, there are tremendous co-benefits to solving climate change, namely getting our fossil fuel use to effectively zero will save somewhere around 10 million lives per year. And that's not some crazy NGO saying that. That's the Harvard School of Public Health, a number of the most respected medical journal studies. And then there's connected issues between fossil fuel pollution and climate change, like wildfire smoke, which here on the West Coast and other parts of the world like Australia is reversing all progress made by clean air legislation. So again, if everybody was aware that 1 out of every 5 deaths in the world already is connected to fossil fuel pollution, not even including climate change, just direct air pollution related to fossil fuels. And that doesn't even include cancers related to petrochemical products, asthma related to burning natural gas and cooking, and all the inequity and war and conflict that's connected up to the fossil fuel industry. So you factor all that in, the co-benefits of solving climate change by getting our fossil fuel use to effectively zero are just, there's no comparison. It seems super obvious. It's not a question of can we afford to make this transition? It's really a question of can we afford not to? Because again, somewhere around $23 trillion per year, and that's factoring in the costs of human lives lost as well, is ultimately subsidizing the fossil fuel industry right now, which is way more than we need to mobilize for climate action right now. So just elevating those kind of truths, that's something that hopefully AI technology can help do. But right now, I actually see it as more of a problem than a solution.
Thank you. It's like thank you for this, like all the emphasis and for sharing your views on that. I'm going to pass the word to my colleagues, to Luisa and to Eliza for for continuing the conversation. But thank you. And also please emphasize more, how can we develop the carbon removal market? Because that one is something that needs to be emphasized. We need to move to the importance of science and the importance of science-based decisions, science-based. So that scientific component that is needed, that we can't reduce, but it's like reducing is not enough. And that one is one huge message that we have to do. We need innovation, we need science to be able to develop projects that are focused on carbon removal. So Ian, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. Maria has a flight to catch up, so she needs to leave now. But thank you so much for joining.
And I have well, sorry, and I have offset my emissions just in case.
Oh yeah, great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maria.
Really appreciate your work.
And next, Eliza is going to help with closing remarks.
Hi, yes, apologies to those who have put questions in the chat. We're very short on time, but please feel free to send us any questions you have on social media. I'm sure Ian wouldn't mind you getting in touch as well. So yeah, thank you, a huge thank you to our amazing speakers today, Ian Monroe and Maria Alejandra Gonzalez. Yeah, it's been an honor, Ian, to host you and Maria Alejandra to discuss such a pertinent topic and a great book, of course. Again, many thanks to our sponsors, Caja de Compensación Familiar de Antioquia con Fama, Hill Consulting, the Colombian Congress and International Conference on Air Quality and Public Health, Eco Registry, Cerca Bono, and ISA. And yeah, so just to summarize, we've covered a range of topics today with our speakers focusing on the importance of reaching net zero by 2040 and climate positivity thereafter, and the 8 pillars of climate action we need to get there, from the importance of electrifying the technologies that we use every day and decarbonising this electricity, to the importance of ending deforestation and developing sustainable agricultural practices in minimising the production of non-fossil fuel greenhouse gases, how companies could incentivise climate action by linking job promotions to climate targets, and how more money can be directed towards climate solutions through cheap loans and grants for companies developing climate technologies, and importantly, how the cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of action on the climate challenge. So yeah, if you want to learn more about this topic, you can find Ian's new book, Solving Climate Change, at solvingclimate.org. And we will share the presentation that Ian used with everyone who signed up to the talk by email. And yes, if you don't follow us already, you can find Low Carbon City on Twitter or Instagram, and please stay in touch. And we hope to see you again at future events. And yeah, sorry, Louisa, go ahead.
We have a small survey that we want to share with you to know what you think about this presentation, whether topics you would like us to talk in future events, and how will you rate this presentation. So that will help us a lot to improve. And also go to solveclimate.org. That's the page for Ian's and John's new book. And you can learn more about the contents, the solutions, the data, and all of the ecosystem to really get to net zero by 2040 and then be climate positive with the climate. So thank you so much. Please, for the people who fills the survey, we are going to be sending the presentation that Ia is going to kindly share with us. So thank you so much. And we're going to have this recording available on YouTube in the next couple of days.
Thanks again so much for having me and for your time. And for all of you that have follow-up questions that we didn't have a chance to go to, apologies for being a bit verbose, but I'm happy to connect. You can find me easily on LinkedIn. And then I also put up my Stanford email there is one way to connect, and I'm happy to connect with any and all of you that are working on climate solutions that are interested in collaborating and looking for more ways to do it. I will also quickly toss out that beyond the book, Etho Capital and our climate investing team has helped launch a new organization called the Climate Positive Investing Alliance that you can find at positiveclimate.org. And we're really trying to bring together all investors and nonprofits and supporting ecosystem members that are trying to push towards this climate positive future and ensure that we're doing it in a way that's real and meaningful and doing it as quickly as possible. So if you're interested in joining the Alliance, check out positiveclimate.org, and that'll also be in the slides. And thanks again for all of you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Ian.
Yeah, thanks for
Thanks for
watching.
coming, everyone.
Bye.